March 1943, Paris, when the city still smelled faintly of burnt paper and diesel. The cafés smelled of roasted beans and betrayal. The women behind the counters smiled politely, but every cup they served could mean another German convoy destroyed. History remembers the soldiers, but in the quiet cafés of occupied France, women fought a different kind of war, armed with courage, coded words, and a cup of coffee. German boots clicked across cobblestone like a metronome of control. Inside Le Coquelicot, a small café tucked between two shuttered bookstores, the espresso machine hissed, sharp, metallic, alive. At a corner table, two Wehrmacht officers laughed over cognac. Their laughter was too loud, too forced, the kind of noise meant to drown out fear. Behind the counter, a woman with chestnut hair wiped down a cup, her hands steady, her eyes quiet. Her name, to those who knew her real self, was Claire Dubois, but on her forged papers, she was Marie Lefebvre, café owner and model citizen of occupied Paris. She smiled when the soldiers looked her way, that soft, disarming French smile that made them feel welcome, even safe. But beneath the counter, her fingers brushed the metal edge of a small transmitter hidden in a bread tin. The café's warm chatter masked the faint hum of a coded signal. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Fräulein?" one officer said in his broken French. Claire's voice was light. "The sun makes even rationed coffee taste rich, don't you think?" He laughed, not noticing that his own words, "Tomorrow, fuel convoy from Rouen," were being quietly memorized, every syllable stitched into her memory like thread. At dusk, when the café emptied, Claire locked the door, flipped the sign to fermé, and exhaled for the first time all day. The silence was sacred, the sound of the city holding its breath. She lifted a loose floorboard near the back room and pulled out a compact radio set, its metal warm from use. "London calling," the static whispered. The voice on the other end was faint, but clear enough. She scribbled on a napkin, coordinates, times, names, information worth lives. Information gathered not with guns, but with glances, overheard whispers, and the polite curiosity of a woman who knew how to disappear in plain sight. Outside, the curfew bell echoed across Paris. She doused the lights, opened the back door, and vanished into the night. Somewhere, an Allied bomber squadron waited for the coordinates she had just sent, and a German fuel depot was about to vanish before dawn. They'd call it luck, but in truth, it was the work of women like her, invisible soldiers hidden behind aprons and smiles. History remembers the generals, the maps, the battles, but it forgets the cafés, the quiet places where the war's outcome began to tilt. By the spring of 1943, Nazi occupation had settled over France like a heavy fog, familiar, suffocating, impossible to escape. The resistance existed, but barely. Every whisper could be death. Every act of defiance came with a cost, measured not in courage, but in consequences. And yet, an army was forming, one that carried no rifles, wore no uniforms, and moved through German checkpoints with a basket of bread instead of a gun. They were secretaries, nurses, singers, and waitresses, women who had learned how to blend into the rhythm of daily life and then turn that rhythm into resistance. The British Special Operations Executive, Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, had realized early on that women could move more freely than men under occupation. Few German officers searched them, and fewer still suspected that the waitress serving their coffee might be transmitting troop movements to London before sunset. One such woman Odette Sansom, mother of three, was recruited by SOE's French section. She parachuted into France under the codename Lise, carrying only a radio, a pistol, and the courage of someone who had already lost everything once. Another, Violette Sabo, 22 years old, fluent in French, used her charm and wit to collect intelligence across cafés and safe houses in Rouen and Limoges. But not all were trained agents. Many were civilians, women like Claire, who had simply refused to bow. Some had lost husbands to German prisons. Others had watched friends taken for questioning and never returned. Their rebellion began not with explosives, but with small, quiet acts, hiding letters under loaves of bread, delivering microfilm wrapped in wax paper, passing coded notes in cigarette boxes. Each day required performance, the art of smiling while terrified. The occupation demanded silence, but they answered with cunning. "Do you ever feel afraid?" one young courier asked her mentor. "Every hour," the older woman replied. "Fear means you're still alive to finish the job." They called themselves les femmes de l'ombre, the women of the shadows. They didn't see themselves as heroes. Most didn't even see themselves as soldiers. They were survivors who decided to fight back in the only way they could, by making the occupier feel safe in the very places they were being hunted. By 1944, hundreds of women across France were feeding intelligence to Allied command through cafés, salons, boarding houses, and train stations. Some died nameless. Others lived to see liberation, only to be forgotten. But without them, many Allied operations, including the D-Day landings, might have ended in disaster. The Invisible Army had no banner, no song, no medals. But it had something stronger: conviction. By daylight, the war seemed far away inside the cafés. German officers read newspapers. Parisians queued for weak coffee brewed from chicory and rationed sugar. Jazz, the forbidden sound, sometimes slipped through the radio, soft enough to suggest defiance, quiet enough not to provoke it. The women behind the counters became the pulse of survival. They knew everyone: the regulars, the collaborators, the resistance couriers who never ordered the same drink twice. A café was not just a place for caffeine. It was a stage where eyes met, hands trembled, secrets changed owners. Claire served with grace, never lingering, never forgetting. She memorized faces, insignias, words. Her apron hid a small note sewn into the lining. Numbers and initials that only one man in London could decode. At noon, a truck convoy would pass through the Rue Saint-Antoine. By evening, the message would be on a radio frequency London knew by heart. Her café's back room smelled of smoke and fear. The cupboard doubled as a message drop. The sugar tin held film reels instead of sugar. Sometimes, the German officers themselves brought the clues, boasting about supply lines or troop movements, unaware that their laughter was feeding Allied intelligence. Every cup of coffee served to them carried a price. Every smile could be the last. But survival demanded performance. "Would you like more sugar, monsieur?" she asked one officer. He nodded absently, flipping through his orders. She poured, and in that moment, her eyes caught the words: Movement, Le Havre, 23. She would remember it later, when the café emptied and the moonlight turned the cups into silver ghosts. Outside, the air carried the faint smell of gasoline and damp brick. In the distance, someone was playing an accordion. Life went on, stubborn, fragile, brave. To the Germans, the café was harmless. To the resistance, it was a lifeline. And so, the facade had to remain perfect. Every laugh rehearsed, every tremor suppressed, every day a new act of theater performed for survival. Nightfall was when the war turned intimate. The streets of Paris emptied, shutters closed, footsteps became whispers. The curfew transformed the city into a breathing creature of shadows. Claire would move carefully through the back alleys, her basket filled not with bread, but with fuses and small packets of plastique wrapped in newspaper. Other women joined her. Jeanne, who once danced at the Moulin Rouge. Elise, who worked in a dress shop but could dismantle a radio faster than most soldiers. They met in basements, cellars, and railway tunnels, lit only by candlelight and faith. Plans were whispered, not written. 2 trucks, 3 guards, Jean murmured. At dawn. Claire nodded. We do it quiet. Their missions varied, derailing trains, cutting communication lines, setting fire to fuel depots. Each act felt small, but together they became a rhythm of defiance, pulsing through occupied France. Every explosion that shattered a Nazi convoy was a message. We are still here. But the cost was high. Arrests were frequent. The Gestapo's files thickened by the week. Torture, deportation, disappearance. They knew the risks. Still, they chose to fight. One night, after a successful sabotage near Rouen, Claire returned to her café. The glass was cracked, the sign torn down. Someone had talked. She spent the next 3 hours burning papers, scrubbing fingerprints, erasing herself. When dawn came, the café was spotless, as if nothing had ever happened. She smiled at the officers when they arrived for their morning coffee. "Rough night, madam?" one asked casually. "Only the usual," she said. He didn't notice the smell of smoke on her hands, or had turned her into a ghost, alive, but already fading into history's blind spot. That night, the café's radio hummed again. The message was short, deliberate, final. Target destroyed. 2 losses. Keep faith. The women's spies of occupied France didn't march. They didn't salute. They endured, one quiet act at a time. The Gestapo rarely shouted. Their cruelty was quieter, methodical, bureaucratic, precise. The sound of their boots on wooden stairs was often the only warning that the facade had finally cracked. For months, Claire had balanced between survival and exposure with the grace of a tightrope walker. But by the winter of 1944, the rope was fraying. The Allies were pushing toward Normandy, and German paranoia was tightening like a noose around every whisper of dissent. She began noticing small changes. A new face at the end of the street. A man in civilian clothes, ordering the same drink 3 days in a row. A question too casually asked. "Have you ever been to Rouen, madame?" The Gestapo had started to map her world. One evening, as the café emptied, Claire heard a faint knock at the side door. 3 taps. A pause. 2 more. The code. She opened it to find Elise, pale and trembling, her lipstick smeared, her hands bloodied. "They took Jean," she whispered. "At dawn, someone talked." The words froze Claire's spine. Jean, the dancer who could crack safes with a hairpin, gone. The Gestapo had raided her apartment, the radio, the explosives, the lists. If they found Jean's notebook, half the network could unravel overnight. "Did she?" Claire began, unable to finish. Elise shook her head. "She didn't break, but they'll keep trying." There was no time for grief. By midnight, Claire had burned every scrap of coded message hidden beneath the cafe floorboards. The transmitter, her lifeline to London, she dismantled and buried behind the wine cellar wall. If they came, she wanted no trace. But in the quiet hours, fear crept in like smoke. The cafe, once her sanctuary, now felt like a stage set for an inevitable arrest. Every customer's glance seemed too long. Every question too curious. She rehearsed lies in her head as she served the morning crowd. My husband was conscripted. I only serve coffee. I don't ask questions. But lies had a taste, bitter and metallic. 3 days later, the Gestapo came. 2 officers in dark coats, gloves spotless, eyes colder than the January wind. They asked about Jeanne, about the radio, about the nights when the cafe was closed early. Claire smiled, feigning confusion. I run a business, messieurs. I serve whoever pays. One officer leaned in, his breath sharp with tobacco. If we search your cellar, will we find anything interesting? She held his gaze, her heart hammering so loud she feared he could hear it. Only wine, she said softly. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy, dangerous. Then he straightened, smirked, and said, We'll be watching you. When they left, Claire's knees gave out. She sat on the floor, trembling, knowing how close the blade had come. That night, she walked to the Seine and stared at her reflection. The water rippled, a face both hers and not. The woman who had once dreamed of owning a simple cafe was gone. What remained was a soldier without a uniform, fighting a war the world might never see. By early 1944, sabotage had become the pulse of occupied France. Every bridge that collapsed, every train that derailed, every German truck that vanished into flame, all were brushstrokes in the invisible rebellion. But sabotage wasn't just explosions. It was also delay, disruption, deception. One of Claire's quietest missions was her most effective. A group of engineers at a German depot near Chartres were preparing fuel convoys for the front. The resistance needed their schedules, and she was the only one close enough to listen. Through a contact, she secured a catering job for the depot's officers' mess. She arrived each day in a worn apron, her hair tied back, a tray in hand. Her French politeness disarmed suspicion. As she poured wine, she memorized train numbers. As she cleared plates, she slipped messages beneath napkins to a mechanic loyal to the cause. Convoy leaving at dawn, he whispered one afternoon. Bridge at Saint-Pierre-sur-Aire. That night, Claire and 2 others placed charges beneath the bridge's steel beams. Rain poured as they worked, the Seine swollen and violent. The timer clicked softly. When the explosion came, it was not just sound. It was liberation. A column of trucks plunged into the dark water below, flames reflecting off the current. But joy never lasted. The next morning, she returned to the cafe as if nothing had happened. Smoke from the sabotage still smeared the sky miles away. A German officer, red-faced with fury, slammed his fist on her counter. Saboteurs, he spat. They think we won't find them. Claire poured his coffee calmly. Maybe they already left, she said quietly. He didn't catch the irony. The cost of each act grew heavier. Elise was captured in March. Another courier vanished in April. The Gestapo's prisons swelled with ghosts. Torture rooms in Fresnes echoed with names and cries, but rarely confessions. Sometimes, Claire walked past the cafes that had gone silent. Owners arrested, families gone. She imagined their laughter, their courage, the weight of what they'd done. At night, she wrote letters she could never send. If anyone finds this, tell them we tried. Tell them courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it's the sound of someone pretending to laugh in front of her enemy. By June, word spread of an impending invasion. London's coded broadcasts grew urgent. The long sobs of the violins of autumn, the first line of Verlaine's poem, the prearranged signal. It meant the Allies were coming. Claire listened in her darkened back room, tears mixing with the dust on her hands. For years, she had fought a hidden war, never knowing if it mattered. Now, for the first time, she believed it might. The next night, she risked everything. She reassembled her buried transmitter, tuning it by instinct. Her hands shook as she sent one last message. Bridges sabotaged. Rail lines down. Paris is waiting. Then she destroyed the radio, smashed it, piece by piece, and scattered it into the Seine. She watched the ripples fade. The city was quiet again, but something inside her shifted. The silence no longer felt like fear. It felt like anticipation. Liberation didn't come as a parade. It came as chaos, rumor, and gunfire echoing through narrow streets. In August 1944, Allied tanks rolled into Paris. The tricolor flag fluttered again above the Hôtel de Ville. People cheered, wept, embraced. Café doors that had been shut for years swung open to the sunlight. Claire stood among the crowd, anonymous as ever. Soldiers passed by, smiling, offering cigarettes. She smiled back, but inside, she felt only exhaustion. A bone-deep emptiness no victory could fill. Her café, Le Coquelicot, survived. The Germans had looted it on their retreat, taking her wine, her radio, even the clock on the wall. But they couldn't take what had lived within those walls. The whispers, the danger, the defiance. For weeks, she cleaned, rebuilt, reopened. Parisians returned, eager to taste normal life again. But some faces were missing. Jean, Elise, and so many others who hadn't lived to see the day. Every corner of the café carried ghosts. The back table where she'd hidden messages. The wall where she'd buried the transmitter. The stairs where the Gestapo once stood. Liberation brought justice, but also revenge. Collaborators were dragged through the streets, their heads shaved, their shame made public. Claire watched silently, unsure what justice meant anymore. A British officer from the SOE visited her one afternoon. His name was Major Halliday, the same voice she'd heard over the radio countless nights. He came to thank her, to tell her that her reports had helped target German fuel lines before D-Day. She nodded. Quiet. You saved lives, he said gently. More than you'll ever know. Claire looked at her hands, still rough from scrubbing cups. And lost others, she murmured. The major hesitated, then offered her a medal. She declined. It's enough that we won, she said. Then, after a pause, did we? Because victory felt complicated. The world called her a hero, but she still woke in the night to phantom footsteps, to knocks that weren't there. Freedom didn't erase the fear. It only changed its name. Weeks later, she visited a cemetery outside Paris. The resistance had buried its fallen, men and women together, without rank. The air smelled of wet grass and smoke. On one grave, she left a coffee cup, chipped, familiar, a token from the life they had built in shadows. She whispered, for Jean, for Elise, for every woman who smiled when she wanted to scream. As she walked away, she heard laughter from a nearby street, children playing free at last. For the first time in years, it didn't sound fragile. History would move on, naming generals, dates, victories. But the war she remembered lived in quieter places. The back rooms, the whispered passwords, the taste of fear behind a smile. Claire's cafe never became famous. It didn't need to. For those who knew, Le Coquelicot had already become something greater, a symbol of the war fought in silence. And every morning, as the coffee machine hissed to life once more, the sound was more than routine. It was a remembrance. Years passed before anyone came asking questions. By the 1950s, the streets of Paris were full again. Laughter in the cafés, jazz in the night air. The war fading into memory like a dream no one wanted to remember too clearly. Tourists snapped photographs beneath the Eiffel Tower, unaware that the city's bricks still held secrets. And in one small café on Rue Saint-Antoine, an old woman still polished her counter until it gleamed. The name on the sign was the same, Le Coquelicot. Only the hands behind the counter had aged. Claire rarely spoke of the war. When curious customers asked where she had been during the occupation, she would smile faintly and say, "Here, serving coffee, same as now." It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the whole truth. Some nights, when the crowd thinned and the jazz faded into silence, she would catch herself staring at the backroom door. The one that used to hide the transmitter. The one that had once glowed faintly from the heat of risk. She could almost hear the whisper of radio static, the coded voices from London that had once meant hope. They said time heals, but she had learned otherwise. Time only layers. It buries fear beneath memory, memory beneath silence. But underneath, the pulse still beats. Her neighbors had their own scars. Some bore medals, others carried shame. And everywhere, the war's legacy lingered, not in monuments, but in the faces of those who had survived it. The government eventually began recognizing the women of the resistance. Names like Odette Sansom, Violette Szabo, and Nancy Wake were spoken in ceremonies, printed in history books. They received honors, medals, even films. But thousands of others remained unnamed, women whose courage had no witnesses, whose deeds dissolved in the anonymity that had once kept them alive. One historian who came to interview Claire called them the invisible backbone of liberation. Claire only smiled. "We weren't the backbone," she said quietly. "We were the heartbeat." For every known story, there were hundreds that vanished. Burned letters, destroyed records, unspoken vows. The women spies had learned to erase themselves so completely that even after peace, they didn't know how to stop disappearing. But traces remained. Old ledgers with strange symbols in the margins. Recipes for coffee blends that doubled as cipher keys. Cupboards that hid compartments long after the war ended. Once, a young journalist asked Claire if she ever regretted it. Living years under fear, risking death for secrets that few would ever acknowledge. She thought for a long time before answering. "Regret?" she said softly. "No, but sometimes I miss the clarity, when every choice mattered. When courage wasn't something you talked about, it was just something you did." The journalist asked what it had felt like, being a spy, a saboteur, a woman in a man's war. She smiled again, sad and distant. "It felt like making coffee with a gun pointed at your heart," she said. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. The city glowed under the street lamps, alive again, indifferent and beautiful. She watched as young couples hurried past, their laughter echoing down the wet cobblestones. They would never know the weight of silence she had carried. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. Still, the ghosts lingered. Every August, on the anniversary of liberation, Claire would close the café early. She'd walk down to the river where she had once thrown the fragments of her radio into the Seine. The water flowed endlessly, the same as it had during the occupation. Patient, unjudging. She'd toss a single coffee bean into the current and whisper a name. Sometimes Jean, sometimes Elise, sometimes none at all. She never cried. She had spent all her tears in 1944, but she always smiled, a quiet, grateful smile, as the bean vanished downstream, a small, private salute to those who had fought a war no one saw. The years blurred. The city changed. And when Claire finally passed away in her sleep one winter morning, the news didn't make headlines. Her funeral was modest. A handful of neighbors, a priest, and an unmarked envelope left on her coffin by a stranger in a dark coat. Inside was a medal, tarnished, old, with a note written in fading ink. For services rendered, for silence kept. No one ever discovered who sent it. After her death, when the café was sold, the new owners found something wedged behind the cellar wall. A rusted bread tin, the one that had once hidden her transmitter. Inside was a folded piece of paper, brittle with age. It read, "If you find this, know that this place once fought back. History has a strange way of remembering. It honors the loud, the visible, the victorious. But wars are also won by the quiet ones, the ones who fight with patience, not bullets, with secrets, not slogans." The women spies of occupied France were not just saboteurs or couriers. They were mothers, daughters, lovers, people who carried courage like a secret flame, small but unyielding. They learned to weaponize the ordinary, a smile, a cup, a conversation, and turn it against tyranny. They remind us that resistance does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers from behind a café counter. And perhaps that is the truest form of heroism, not the kind carved in stone, but the kind that leaves behind a faint trace of warmth, like the smell of coffee long after the shop has closed. When the credits roll, when the last image fades, we are left with one thought, one echo that refuses to die. They lived ordinary lives in extraordinary times. They fought without recognition, and in the quiet hum of their courage, history found its pulse again.